The HOA thought shutting off my cabin's water would break me, until their own taps ran dry and they realized I owned every pipe feeding their homes. The cabin was quiet, except for the groan of the pipes hidden beneath the floorboards. I'd grown used to their voice over the years. Low moans in winter, sharp ticks in summer. But last week, the voice changed. Someone was tampering with the water. I didn't panic. I just watched. Because unlike them, I knew every inch of this land. They came in pairs, pressed suits, polished shoes, and fake smiles. The HOA board. Their leader, a man with a sharp jaw and colder eyes, stood on my porch holding a clipboard. "Your water usage is unauthorized," he said. "Strange," I replied. "Been using it for years." They smirked, thinking they had me cornered. But they had no idea what they were walking into. The third day after our last encounter with the HOA began like any other at the lake. Mist hovered low over the water, curling around the pines like smoke from an unseen fire. The air carried that damp chill only mornings near water can hold. From the porch of my cabin, coffee steaming in my hands, I watched the world wake slow and quiet. But beneath that stillness, I could feel something brewing. The HOA wasn't done, not by a long shot. By late afternoon, the first hints came. A faint metallic clatter carried through the trees, sharp enough to stand out from the ordinary hum of cicadas. At first, I thought it might have been someone hammering in a dock post, or maybe a truck tailgate slamming. But the rhythm of it, clank, pause, clank, was too deliberate. Tools. Heavy ones. I set my mug down, listening. From the south end of the property, near the old utility road, the sound grew louder. And then came voices. Men's voices, carrying that smug, careless confidence that only comes when people believe they've already won. I knew exactly what they were after. The shut-off valve. For weeks, maybe months, they'd been trying to sniff it out, studying easements, peering over survey maps they barely understood, walking the brush lines like hunters searching for fresh tracks. They thought they were clever, that they'd finally outsmarted me. I stayed out of sight, watching from behind the tree line as 4 of them worked the ground. 2 crouched by a steel plate half hidden in the weeds, prying it open with crowbars. The others leaned on shovels, laughing and talking big, already tasting victory. "Finally got the bastard," one said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Should have done this weeks ago. Man's been sucking off our lines for years." Their ignorance would have been funny if it wasn't so predictable. I knew the valve they'd found. It was the wrong one. A relic from an old irrigation project, long abandoned when the county rerouted service decades ago. Rust had sealed it half shut, but with enough muscle they'd get it to turn. And when it did, they'd be so sure they'd cut me off. I smiled to myself. Let them have their little celebration. The sun dipped lower, staining the lake orange. Their voices carried all the way across the water. I could hear the squeal of metal as they forced the wheel. The men cheered, hooped, slapped each other's backs. "Done. He's finished now. Let's see him beg for water tomorrow." I walked back to my cabin, calm as ever. They didn't know the truth, that the cabin's water system wasn't tied to that line at all. When I rebuilt the place years ago, I'd sunk my own well deep into the aquifer beneath the ridge. Independent. Private. Mine. The line they'd shut off fed their own tract. Their manicured lawns, their thirsty flower beds, their endless rows of sprinklers, all of it depended on that single feed. By nightfall, the reckoning began. I stayed up late, lantern lit, listening for the signs. Around 9, a faint cough echoed through the still air, a sprinkler head spitting in vain somewhere down the shoreline. Then another. By 10, I could hear the first frustrated shouts drifting across the dark water. What the hell's wrong with this thing? Check the breaker. Check the timer. Someone slammed a door. Another cursed loud enough for the whole cove to hear. By midnight, the truth was setting in. Faucets gurgled with nothing but air. Toilets flushed once, then sat empty. Dishwashers ground their gears dry. Hose bibs hissed and spat before going silent. The next morning, I strolled to the dock with my coffee as if nothing unusual had happened. From across the water, I could see them gathered in small clusters on their decks, holding plastic buckets, jugs, and empty pitchers. A couple dragged garden hoses down to the shoreline, trying to siphon lake water up into their homes. One man yelled at another. Two women argued over whose kid had left the bathroom faucet running. A lawn that only yesterday had looked like emerald carpet now began its slow turn toward brittle brown. By noon, the whole development reeked of frustration. The HOA president himself, red-faced and sweating, stomped around with his cell phone glued to his ear, shouting into the receiver at whoever would listen. From my porch, I could hear every word. No, it's not just me. It's the whole block. Nothing comes out, not a drop. Don't give me that, the bill's paid. I don't care whose jurisdiction it is. You get someone out here now. Every plea fell flat. The county knew the system. They knew the dead valve wasn't on their grid anymore. They also knew, though none of the neighbors did, that I wasn't on their service at all. By late afternoon, the air shimmered with heat. Tempers flared hotter. Children cried for water, while parents barked at them to just wait. Sprinklers sat frozen like skeletal arms reaching for rain that would never come. Toilets filled with sour-smelling bowls that no amount of air freshener could mask. I walked among my pines, my well pump humming steady beneath the soil, sending clear, cold water up into my pipes. I filled a tall glass, let the condensation run down its side, and sat back in the shade. From where I sat, I could see them struggling, buckets swinging, arguments breaking out. It wasn't my water they'd shut off. It was theirs. And by the looks of it, this was only the beginning. By the time the weekend rolled around, the community center looked like a hornet's nest kicked wide open. The parking lot overflowed with pickup trucks and SUVs, the kind of suburban fleet that usually sat gleaming in their driveways as trophies of success. Today, they stood haphazardly, dust already clinging to their paint jobs, because no one cared enough to polish appearances. Their owners were angry, desperate. Inside, the hall was sweltering. The air conditioners hummed uselessly, pushing nothing but recycled warmth into the packed room. The water coolers that usually stood in the corner like silent servants were empty, their plastic jugs drained to the last drop, paper cones scattered around like relics of better days. People sat fanning themselves with mailers, HOA newsletters, anything that could move air across their damp foreheads. The board had called this an emergency gathering. They had meant it as a chance to regain control, to smother panic before it spread too far. Instead, it had poured gasoline on the fire. The president, a portly man named Randall with a permanent sunburn and an inflated sense of authority, stood behind the podium. His tie hung limp and crooked, his shirt stained dark beneath the armpits. Flanking him were the rest of the board, for volunteers who had once believed running an HOA was about potlucks and neighborhood watch, not surviving a crisis that clawed at every household. "Please, everyone, please," Randall began, raising his hands. His voice cracked. "Let's settle down." The crowd erupted before he could finish. "Settle down? My kids can't flush the toilet." A woman in the front row snapped, her face redder than his tie. "My lawn's turning to hay." Another shouted from the back. "You promised service would be uninterrupted." A chorus of accusations surged, overlapping until Randall's words drowned. He banged the gavel against the podium, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot, but it did little to silence them. The room had the energy of a mob, contained only by thin walls and their collective lack of direction. I sat in the far corner, back row, as unnoticed as the old exit sign flickering above me. From there, I had the perfect view. The panic spread across faces in waves. Fear, anger, suspicion. Husbands whispering blame at wives. Neighbors glaring at each other as if thirst had drawn invisible battle lines. They didn't see me. They didn't think to. I was just another body in the room, quiet, insignificant. But I was the one who knew the truth. Water wasn't just water. It was control. And right now, I had every drop. The board scrambled, each taking turns at the microphone. "It's just a temporary outage," one of them insisted, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Maintenance issue," another chimed in. "We've contacted the county, and they assure us everything is under review." "Review?" someone barked. "My wife's been filling buckets out of the lake all morning." Review doesn't flush a damn toilet. The words hit like a stone tossed into a hornet's nest. Shouts broke out again. Someone pounded the folding table so hard the legs rattled. Children started crying, their small voices cutting through the chaos like nails on glass. I leaned back, letting it all wash over me. Their fear was almost tangible, like humidity thickening the air. Randall wiped his brow, his face shiny. Folks, please. We are working on a solution. You have to trust us. These things happen. We just need to stay calm. But no one was calm. From his second row, a man with a farmer's tan stood, pointing a finger at him. This isn't just an inconvenience, Randall. This is survival. No water means no sanitation. No water means sickness. You know what happens when systems break down? People turn on each other. His voice shook, not with fear, but with conviction. And you're hiding something. We all know it. The accusation landed like a thunderclap. Heads turned. Murmurs spread. The board members exchanged panicked glances, their composure crumbling. I watched them squirm, scrambling to hold their fragile authority together with duct tape and denial. Every promise they made only deepened suspicion. Every excuse only hardened the anger in the crowd. And all the while, I sat silent, knowing the truth clawed at them just beneath the surface. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a storm-damaged line or a county oversight. It was them. They had turned the wheel themselves, celebrating their cleverness while they strangled their own lifeline. But they couldn't admit that. To confess it would be to reveal incompetence so deep it bordered on betrayal. So they lied, and lied badly. As voices rose, someone shouted what everyone else had been thinking. If you can't fix this, then step down. We need leadership, not excuses. The room erupted again. The gavel slammed. Randall's voice broke as he tried to yell over them, veins bulging at his temples. His words no longer carried weight. And I just sat there, watching, drinking in a collapse like a cool glass of well water on a hot day. Because I knew something they didn't. Water could turn neighbors into enemies. It could turn polished homes into crumbling shells. It could strip away the illusions of order and expose the raw need beneath. And every second that ticked by, their desperation grew. I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to say a word. All I had to do was wait. The sound of machinery arrived before the sunrise. Engines growled low across the ridge, their rumbles echoing off the lake as trucks pulled into the community road. Headlights cut through the last blue veil of dawn, casting long shadows across driveways where neighbors stood in bathrobes, clutching empty coffee mugs filled only with habit and no water. The HOA had finally taken its next desperate step. Contractors spilled from their vehicles like ants, carrying clipboards, rolled maps, and survey stakes. Yellow safety vests glowed under the early light, already stained with dust. Behind them came the engineers, men in hard hats whose white shirts had turned gray at the collars. Their faces already shone with sweat, and the day had barely begun. The residents followed, clustering in little knots at the edges of lawns and sidewalks, murmuring like a congregation awaiting sermon. Some clung to hope, others sharpened their anger, but every single one of them was thirsty. I sat on my porch, mug in hand, watching the circus unfold. My coffee was fresh, my water clear. The first shovels hit dirt near the southern edge of the subdivision. The clank of steel against earth rang steady, joined by the mechanical groan of an auger drilling in a ground baked hard by weeks of summer. Engineers bent low over spread-out maps, their fingers tracing faded blue lines across parchment that looked older than most of the homes standing there. One man cursed under his breath. Another wiped his forehead and muttered, "These schematics don't make sense." They kept digging. Hours passed. By noon, trenches cut the land open like scars, exposing roots, rocks, and old iron pipe crusted with rust. The smell of wet soil rose thick as they unearthed forgotten infrastructure buried decades ago. The board hovered nearby, pretending authority they didn't have. Randall, red-faced as ever, barked questions no one could answer. How long? What's the issue? You're sure it's not sabotage? The contractors didn't reply. They were too busy scratching their heads, turning valves that hissed with nothing but air, consulting records that contradicted each other. And then came the moment. One engineer, taller than the rest, pulled his hard hat off and crouched low by a junction unearthed near the property line, my property line. He brushed away dirt with his gloved hand, revealing a T-shaped pipe splitting in 3 directions. His eyes narrowed. His lips moved as he whispered calculations to himself. The others gathered around him, murmuring. Fingers pointed toward the cabin on the ridge, my cabin. Maps were unfolded again, compared to what their eyes told them. Silence spread across their faces like ink soaking through cloth. I could see it from where I sat. The realization, the truth bleeding into them until the color drained from their skin. The water line didn't feed me. I fed them. Every lawn, every faucet, every gleaming toilet and sprinkler and dishwasher in their precious subdivision. All of it ran through one forgotten junction. Buried decades ago, overlooked when the county shifted records, dismissed as obsolete. A relic, they thought. But relics have power. The line that kept their homes alive pulsed through my land. The valve that determined their survival sat under my control. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the cool rim of glass against my lips as I sipped. The contractors muttered louder now, their confusion turning to unease. The HOA board huddled, their voices rising in frantic whispers. Residents shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between one another, searching for someone to blame. But blame was pointless. The truth had settled on them heavy and undeniable. Without me, they were nothing but dry pipes and brittle lawns. By late afternoon, the trenches stretched like open wounds across the development. Children pressed their faces to windows, watching the grown-ups panic. Men dragged garden hoses to the lake, filling buckets murky with algae. Women whispered about disease, about how long they could last like this. And I closed my cabin door, locked it, listened as the pipes groaned beneath my floorboards, a sound I'd heard for years, but never like this. Tonight, the groan was different, low, resonant, like the voice of the earth itself. And in that voice, I could hear the words as clear as if spoken aloud. They thought they owned you, but you own them all. I smiled in the dark, the corners of my mouth pulling tight. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was dominion. Morning broke, but it didn't feel like morning. It felt like judgment. The sun climbed slow and merciless over the ridge, glaring down on lawns that had once shimmered like emerald carpets. Now, under the weight of drought and futility, they curled into brittle husks. The air carried the faint, sour smell of dry soil, of chlorophyll dying in the heat. Sprinkler heads stood frozen, like monuments to a luxury gone extinct. Inside every home, faucets coughed emptiness. Showers ran hollow, spitting a mist of air before falling silent. Toilets flushed once, then stayed dry, bowls slowly staining in ways the families couldn't hide. The first hours of the day rang not with birdsong, but with the sound of doors slamming, voices cursing, children crying for things their parents couldn't give them. And then came the swimming pool. At the center of a neighborhood sat Randall's kingdom, the HOA president's house, a monument to excess. For years, his pool had been the jewel of summer, water so blue it looked painted, always filled to the brim as if mocking the lake itself. But without refill, without the constant hidden stream keeping it alive, the waterline sank inch by inch. By morning's end, cracks spread like veins across the plaster. The sun hammered down, the chlorine stung, and the once pristine oasis looked like a pit. The sound of tile fracturing echoed across the cul-de-sac like bones breaking. The symbol of their pride was bleeding out before their eyes. From my porch, I poured a glass of water cold and clean. The pump hummed steady beneath the cabin floor, pushing life where I commanded it. Condensation rolled down the glass, beating and dripping onto my hand. I took a long sip, letting it wash across my tongue, slow and deliberate. Every swallow was a reminder. It wasn't me who was trapped. It was them. Across the water, I watched the community come apart. Men in sweat-stained shirts carried buckets from the lake, sloshing algae. and minnows into bathtubs that stank after hours. Women lined up with empty jugs, waiting their turn at a neighbor's rain barrel. Children wailed as mothers snapped at them to conserve, to not waste, to understand. Anger replaced patience. Neighbors fought on sidewalks, arguing over whose turn it was to siphon. Someone's hose had been cut in the night, sabotaged. Someone else's rain barrel had been tipped over accidentally. Trust dissolved quicker than the lawns. By mid-morning, a mob formed. They weren't holding torches or pitchforks. This was suburbia, after all, but desperation gave their march the same weight. They stormed toward the board's office, a squat building near the entrance of the subdivision. Normally, it hosted barbecues, bingo nights, neighborhood watch briefings. Today, it pulsed with fury. From my porch, I could hear the roar, even across the trees. Doors slammed. Voices rose like thunder. "Where's our water? You said it was temporary. Fix it or step down." Inside, the board flailed. I imagined Randall wiping sweat from his forehead, face red as his tie, hands shaking as he slammed his gavel again and again. His words no longer mattered. They didn't want reassurances. They wanted survival. And survival wasn't in his hands anymore. It was in mine. I leaned back, savoring the chaos like a spectator at the theater. Every drop they lost was a chain tightening. Every dry faucet was another lock on the cage they'd built for themselves. I wasn't the prisoner. They were, and they hadn't yet learned just how deep their thirst would drive them. By the time they came back, the laughter was gone. No more smug grins. No more self-satisfied chuckles about clever shutoffs and imagined victories. This time, their faces were pale and drawn, their collars stained with sweat, their eyes ringed with sleepless nights. The HOA board arrived in a tight cluster, 4 men and 2 women, but it was Randall, the president, who marched to the front. His steps were heavy, more stomp than stride, the sound of a man trying to force authority into his bones even as it leaked from him with every breath. I sat on the porch, glass of water in hand, the ice clinking softly as I swirled it. The sun glinted off the condensation, droplets sliding down my fingers, disappearing into the thirsty wood beneath me. "Reconnect us," Randall demanded, his voice sharp but trembling. The anger was there, yes, but beneath it swam something else, fear. I tilted my head slowly, savoring the moment. "Reconnect you?" I said, my tone light, almost playful. "Strange, I never disconnected you. Maybe your map's just wrong." A ripple of unease passed through them. They glanced at each other, waiting for someone to call my bluff, but no one spoke. Randall's jaw clenched. "Don't play games with us. We know the truth now. All the lines they run through here." He jabbed a finger toward the soil beneath my porch, as if stabbing the earth itself would bend it to his will. I smiled faintly. Interesting revelation. Shame you only just discovered it. The murmurs behind him grew louder. They were unraveling, and he knew it. So he did what all men like him do when stripped bare. He turned to threats. "You'll face lawsuits," he barked, louder now, trying to rally his board. "We'll take you to court. We'll bury you in fines. We'll call the county, the state, the EPA if we have to. You can't just strangle a community, not in this country." The others nodded, their voices layering over his. "Illegal. You'll regret this. We'll have a sheriff here by sundown." But I knew something they didn't, something their words could never reach. Every inch of this land, every tree, every stone, every forgotten pipe was mine. Legally recorded, signed and sealed decades ago in a courthouse where none of them had ever set foot. When the subdivision was carved from old farmland, a mistake was made, or perhaps a gift. The easement they thought was theirs had never been transferred. The junction they depended on had never been surrendered. It stayed under my name. Ink dried long before any of their vinyl-sided palaces rose from the soil. The pipes weren't just running under my cabin. They belonged to me. I set the glass down on the armrest and leaned forward. "Lawsuits," I repeated softly. "Police? Fines." I let the words hang in the air, brittle as dry twigs. Then I smiled. "You can try. But every record, every plat, every survey says the same thing. It's mine. Not yours. Never was." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Randall's face flushed red, his anger boiling but finding no outlet. His mouth opened, closed, opened again like a fish gasping in shallow water. Behind him, the others shifted nervously, their threats already shriveling. For a moment, I almost pitied them. Almost. I thought of the old man who sold me this land decades ago, his hand shaking as he signed the papers. He told me one thing: never let go of water. They'll try, they'll beg, they'll threaten, but you hold it, and you'll hold everything. Now his words rang true, echoing in the groans of pipes beneath my feet, in the thirst gnawing at the throats of every man, woman, and child across the lake. Their threats were empty, their words dry, and I was just getting started. The first days were the loudest. It started with shouting in the cul-de-sacs, voices echoing off the neatly painted fences the HOA loved to boast about. Women dragged empty buckets out to their driveways, as if holding them toward the sky might summon rain. Men cursed at spigots that coughed air but no water. Children cried, thirsty and confused. The heat pressed down like an iron lid, and every dry mouth only made the tension sharper. By the third day, the smiles that once decorated neighborhood sidewalks, those plastic waves, those forced greetings of good morning and nice lawn, were gone. Instead, eyes darted, lips tightened, and neighbors snapped at one another over trivial things. The absence of water wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a wedge, splitting them apart. At night, the sound of sprinklers that once sang across the neighborhood was gone. Lawns began to brown in uneven patches. Gardens drooped like broken arms. For the retirees, the ones who'd spent decades sculpting flower beds, it was a kind of death, petals collapsing, stems bowing, soil cracking. Their kingdom of perfection, so carefully manicured, was wilting before their eyes. And with every dying plant, whispers began to spread. "Why do we pay them dues?" A man hissed on the sidewalk, his voice sharp as shattered glass. "They said everything was under control." "They lied," another muttered back, clutching a toddler whose lips looked pale and dry. "They hid this from us." Soon, the HOA board could not walk their own streets without feeling the heat of their neighbors' eyes. Inside their meetings, cracks widened into canyons. The president slammed his hand on the table so often that the wood bore a faint groove from his fist. "This is sabotage," he barked, his face red with desperation. "We cannot let one man control us. He's bluffing. He has to be bluffing." But another voice, quieter yet heavier, replied, "You said the same thing last week. And yet my wife hasn't had a hot shower in 9 days. Fingers pointed. Voices rose. Some shouted about suing me, others about calling the county, others still about hiring contractors to reroute the system. But no one could agree, because no one wanted to admit the truth. They had built their little empire on something they never owned. And now that foundation was crumbling. It didn't take long before they came to me, individually, secretly. The first was a treasurer, a man who'd once boasted about his stock portfolio as if it were a holy scripture. He arrived at my cabin late at night, headlights cut before the drive, walking with the timid steps of a thief. He knocked lightly, as if hoping I wouldn't answer. When I opened the door, his smile was weak, his tie loosened, sweat clinging to his brow. "Listen," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder into the dark. We can work something out. How much do you want? I've got cash. I've got investments. Just turn the water back on for my property. Just mine. No one needs to know." His eyes darted like a cornered rat, full of shame but hungrier for survival. I let him finish, then shook my head slowly. "You still don't get it," I said. "This isn't about money." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like it was about to choke him. He left without another word, and he was only the first. Next came the gardener, not officially on the board, but a man who had built his identity around the lush oasis of his backyard. His roses were his pride, his hedge sculptures his art. When the water vanished, his paradise began to shrivel. He came to me weeping, dirt still under his fingernails, his hands trembling as he held them out like a beggar. "I'll do your landscaping for life," he stammered. "For free. Just please let me save them." They're dying. They're all dying. I watched him collapse to his knees on my porch. His voice cracked like brittle twigs, but I only closed the door gently, leaving his sobs to echo into the night. Even the president came, eventually. He didn't beg. He didn't cry. He came with a different strategy. He came with threats dressed in suits, warnings sharpened like blades. He swore he'd bring the law, that police would batter down my door, that judges would sign away my rights with the stroke of a pen. But when he leaned close, when his face twisted with rage, I saw something in his eyes that betrayed him. Fear. He was a man unraveling. A man who had built his throne on paper and signatures and fear of fines. Now stripped of his illusion, he stood naked before me, and he knew it. "You'll regret this," he whispered. But the shake in his voice turned his words hollow. Meanwhile, the residents, the real people, grew restless. The mothers whispered in hushed circles, their children clinging to their skirts. The retirees cursed openly, muttering about betrayal as they stirred empty coffee pots. The gardeners wept over their flower beds, once proud trophies now reduced to skeletal stalks. And the whispers turned into questions. If the board lied about this, what else are they hiding? Why do we keep paying them? What are they good for? Every whisper was a fracture. Every doubt was a crack. And soon, the board was nothing but glass under pressure, splintering with each passing day. I watched from my porch. I didn't need their money. I didn't need their apologies. I'd already won the moment the first spigot ran dry. Because in their world, appearances were everything. Green lawns, glistening sprinklers, blooming roses. They were their currency, their status, their pride. And I had taken it all away. They didn't know it yet, but their empire wasn't just drying up. It was rotting from within. And when something rots, it collapses. That night, as the board held another desperate meeting inside their clubhouse, the air thick with sweat and shouting, I sat on my porch, listening to the faint echoes of their war. The cracks were widening, and soon the collapse would come. The third week, without water, broke something inside the community. What had started as minor complaints, brown lawns, dry flower beds, and unfinished car washes, evolved into a storm of chaos. Entire families lined up at the gas station to buy overpriced jugs of water, their carts clattering, their tempers raw. Mothers clutched gallon containers as if they were gold bars, snapping at strangers who dared reach for the last one on the shelf. Children, sticky with sweat, dragged empty buckets to dry spigots, their little hands twisting knobs that hissed with nothing but air. Their cries echoed through the neighborhood like sirens no one could silence. Fathers tried to stay calm, filling bathtubs with bottled water, rationing sips from paper cups, but their eyes betrayed panic. Water wasn't just comfort anymore. It was survival. The lawns, once a point of pride for the HOA, turned into brittle wastelands. Grass crumbled beneath footsteps, releasing clouds of dust. Garden flowers withered into colorless husks. Even the HOA president's prized rose bushes collapsed, their petals curling like burnt paper. The board meetings grew uglier. Residents stormed in with sweat-stained shirts, demanding answers. "You said it would be fixed last week," one man shouted, slamming his fist against the folding table where the board sat. "It's sabotage," the treasurer insisted, though his voice cracked, betraying his doubt. "Someone's tampering with the main line." "Sabotage? Then why haven't you fixed it?" a mother screamed, clutching a baby who whimpered for water. The president tried to hold control, his face gleaming with stress. "We have contractors, engineers, working on it day and night. We'll find a problem." But there were no contractors. They'd stopped coming after realizing the system had been rerouted in ways no blueprint could explain. Each pipe led them in circles, every valve mocked them, every turn bled into dead ends. Then came the pool incident. The president's Olympic-sized pool, once the jewel of the neighborhood, stood cracked and empty under the baking sun. Children pressed their faces against the iron fence, staring into the dry basin where only broken tiles and dust remained. The president had tried secretly hauling water from tankers, but even that was impossible now. The delivery companies refused to cross the angry protests forming at the neighborhood's entrance. When the last drops dried, so did the illusion of authority. Neighbors turned against neighbors. A man was caught siphoning from a fish tank to keep his toilet flushable. A woman hid gallon jugs under her porch, only to wake one morning to find them stolen. Doors slammed. Shouts filled the air. Rumors spread like wildfire. They're lying to us. They have water somewhere. It's the board. They're hiding it. And still, I sat on my porch at the cabin, my glass of cold, clear water sweating in the heat. The pipe that ran beneath my land hummed softly, carrying the town's lifeline, yet locked at a single valve in my basement. By the fourth week, desperation became violence. Residents stormed the HOA office, pounding on the doors. The secretary barricaded herself inside, sobbing as men outside chanted, "Water! Water! Water!" Windows shattered. Papers flew like confetti into the street. Finally, the president called a meeting on the scorched community lawn, though few could stand in the heat without fainting. Sweat soaked their clothes. Children cried. Faces were red with rage. That's when I arrived, not with a gun, not with a threat, but with a single sentence. Respect my cabin, respect my land. No more threats, no more dues. Do that, and the water flows again. At first, they laughed dry and bitter. Some shouted curses. Others spat at the ground. But when the laughter ended, the silence was louder than any insult. Toilets didn't flush. Faucets didn't drip. Sprinklers didn't turn. And everyone knew I wasn't bluffing. The mob turned on the board, screaming for a decision. The president trembled, his tie loosened, his authority in tatters. Under the weight of their fury and the promise of survival, he signed. A contract, binding and final. My property was released from their authority forever. That night, in the cool quiet of my cabin basement, I turned a single valve. The pipes groaned awake. The air filled with the thunder of rushing water. And across the community, faucets gushed, toilets filled, and showers rained down salvation. The people cheered. The board wept. And I sat alone in the dark, listening to the water roar back to life, knowing freedom had a sound, and it was louder than any applause. Weeks slipped by like whispers carried on the lake breeze. The once yellow lawns, brittle and gasping, now glowed, lush and alive again. Sprinklers ticked in steady rhythms at dawn. The swimming pool, once a dry basin of cracked plaster and discarded leaves, shimmered with blue light under the afternoon sun. Children splashed. Dogs barked. Life had returned to normal, or so it seemed. But beneath that shallow surface, something had shifted. The shouting had stopped. The angry HOA letters, stamped and folded with smug authority, no longer arrived in mailboxes. Meetings that once pulsed with power plays now sat half empty, the air thick with resignation rather than ambition. The president's voice, once booming, commanding, had thinned into a whisper, barely audible even when he dared to speak. And me? I had not lifted a single finger in court, not filed a single document, not raised my voice once in those heated gatherings. I had only sat back, silent, letting the pipes hum beneath the soil. My pipes, my land, my rules. When I walked through town now, people noticed. They stepped aside in the grocery store aisles, not hurriedly, not fearfully, but with a quiet acknowledgement, like parishioners shifting in pews when the minister walked by. Some nodded, some kept their eyes low, but all of them understood. Respect had grown where intimidation once stood. They had learned the oldest truth of survival. Food fills your stomach, but water keeps you alive. And when the taps ran dry, when their showers coughed dust and their glasses sat empty, they realized that no signature, no bylaw, no piece of stamped paper could summon water. Only I could. The HOA president avoided my eyes now. On the rare occasions we crossed paths, he looked suddenly fascinated with his watch, his shoes, the distant horizon, anything but me. His power had been drained, stripped without a gavel or a headline. He had fought battles with paperwork and votes. I fought mine with silence and patience. And patience always outlives arrogance. Back at the cabin, life carried on as it always had. I stacked wood for the coming winter, mended the old screen door, and sat long evenings by the water's edge. The lake stretched wide before me, its surface shifting with subtle ripples, reflecting stars like scattered jewels. Below, hidden but alive, the pipes hummed faintly, a secret chorus beneath the earth, steady and loyal. Sometimes, when the night was still, I could almost hear the town breathing again, drinking from what they once tried to claim as theirs. I would smile then, not with bitterness, but with clarity. The victory wasn't loud. There were no parades, no declarations, no stamp papers in my favor. It was quieter than that, subtler. A victory of endurance. A victory of knowing. They thought water was theirs to regulate. They thought signatures and votes could bend the stream. But water always remembers where it comes from, and water always finds its master. I didn't need to remind them. The land had done it for me. And so, in the silence that followed, I finally found peace. It started with whispers. First at the grocery store, then at the gas station, and eventually even at the church parking lot on Sunday mornings. People didn't look at the HOA board the same way anymore. They weren't respected authority figures. They were walking symbols of failure. For months, the residents had lived under the HOA's threats, fines, and arrogant control. But when the water went dry, those rules meant nothing. The manicured lawns the board prided themselves on had turned brittle and brown. The swimming pool became a cracked, sun-bleached pit, and even the HOA office had a haul in bottled water just to function. The residents remembered. Infighting among the board. At first, the board tried to hold things together. They stood at the front of community meetings in pressed suits and smug smiles, still pretending they had the situation under control. But without water, their promises rang hollow. People started shouting them down. Where were you when my kids couldn't shower for a week? Why am I paying HOA dues when you can't even keep a faucet running? My grass is dead, my property value dropped, and it's your fault. The HOA president, a man who once boomed with confidence, now sweated through his shirt while fumbling with excuses. His vice president contradicted him mid-sentence. The treasurer accused them both of mismanaging funds. One meeting ended with the secretary storming out, vowing never to return. The collapse had begun. Not with lawsuits, not with lawyers, but with the turning of neighbors against their so-called leaders. Financial ruin. The HOA thrived on dues, and for years, homeowners had paid them without question. But when the water crisis hit, payments stopped. Some withheld their checks out of protest. Others simply couldn't afford to pay the HOA and haul in water from town. Within 3 months, the HOA's bank account was nearly empty. Bills stacked up, legal fees, landscaping contracts, electricity for the useless. Pool pumps. Vendors stopped answering their calls. Then came the foreclosure threats. The HOA had taken out loans to fund a community expansion project, assuming endless revenue from dues. Without cash flow, the banks circled like vultures. The once proud board members who used to strut around handing out citations for grass growing an inch too high now avoided their own mailboxes. They knew what was inside: debt notices, angry letters, and threats of legal action. Public humiliation. By summer, the HOA's reputation was ashes. Local news stations picked up the story of the neighborhood that had run dry, hinting at corruption, mismanagement, and arrogance. A camera crew even caught the HOA president sneaking buckets of lake water to his backyard at dawn. The clip went viral. Residents laughed at him. Others jeered. Some wanted revenge. When the board tried to host a rebuilding barbecue at the park, only 7 people showed up. The hot dogs were dry, the grills sputtered, and the event ended in disaster when someone poured out a cooler of melted ice water and shouted. More than the HOA ever gave us, the crowd roared with laughter. That was the final nail in their coffin. Collapse of control. Control is fragile. Once it slips, it shatters. The HOA had always relied on fear. Fines, threats, letters, liens. But after the water crisis, those papers carried no weight. A fine meant nothing when people were hauling jugs from town just to cook dinner. A lien was a joke when the HOA itself was drowning in debt. People stopped caring about the rules altogether. Fences were painted wild colors. Lawns grew untamed. A group of kids even turned the cracked, empty pool into a makeshift skate park. When the HOA president tried to stop them, one of the parents shouted across the street, "You had your chance. Sit down." And he did, the quiet replacement. Eventually, the board resigned, one by one. Some out of shame, others because they couldn't handle the pressure anymore. The HOA office sat empty, its windows dusty, its signs sun-bleached. A group of residents formed a new association. Not a homeowner's tyranny, but a cooperative. Instead of barking rules, they pooled resources, focused on repairs, and built trust. For the first time, people felt like neighbors again. And every time they turned on their taps, they remembered whose pipes really kept the water flowing. Not the HOA. Me.